If you're just sourcing muscle meat, you're going to be deficient in glycine. Typically, most people, if you look at glycine turnover rates, are probably deficient in glycine by about 10 to 13 grams per day. But in some instances, it could be as high as 40 grams per day. And glycine is low in muscle meat and higher in collagenous meats and skin. So that's definitely one reason why I think it's important to either supplement with collagen and or glycine, or consume more collagenous meats to improve the glycine to methionine ratio. And what's interesting is a lot of people say that animal foods are bad and reduce longevity because it's high methionine, but the animal studies also show that if you just supplement with glycine, that inhibits the sort of quote unquote inhibition of, life extension or whatever. So glycine is sort of like the life extending property, and it's not necessarily high methionine, it's the imbalance in glycine and methionine.
That makes sense. So our modern diets and practices have gone away from our ancestral ones. So then that's why the problems occur. It's not that the meat's bad. It's just we're not eating the whole animal. We're not eating the collagenous bits and the bone broth. And so, yeah, another thing you can do, you eat the meat that's by the bone. You can eat all the different, like joints and connective tissues and make bone broth.
Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est o apogeo.
ピーク人間
O melhor humano.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Peak Human Podcast. I'm Brian Sanders. Please start back at episode 1. Please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app or iTunes. Share with a friend. Get your family on board. It's the easiest way to support the podcast for free. As always, we work on the Food Lies film every day. Don't worry about that. It's going well. We also got nosetotale.org sponsoring this podcast. It's how we pay the bills around here. It's a company I started after a couple years of looking into how great animal foods were and how good it was to eat nose to tail and all the great nutrients from organ meats and bone marrow and all that stuff. And I decided instead of getting sponsors, I'd make my own company and get a bunch of great ranchers together and get products to people's door. We have the best way to eat liver. I posted on Instagram my new version of eating liver with cold cooked liver with pickles and cheese. The pickles make the taste go away. It's so great. Fortunately, we don't have much liver for sale on nosetotale.org because we use it all in our primal blend, but you can get the primal beef, primal bison, even pork. We have the organs, more than just the liver, mixed in to the beef, to the pork, to the bison, and that's maybe the best way. I still don't know which way the best way is. Cooking it yourself, eating it raw, or mixing it into the ground meat. They're all good. nosetotale.org. We have the other products like the body care, skin food, almost sold out, the soap. We have the biltong, Drovors, which is the stick version, seasonings. Man, we have the whole meat toolkit for you. We also have a new sort of unofficial sponsor, Lumen. Anyone heard of Lumen? It's this cool device where you blow into it, it measures your CO2, and you can see if you're burning carbs or fat. I just started playing around with it. It helps you figure out if you're metabolically flexible. I can see when I'm in carb burning mode, and then I can switch to fat burning mode by the next morning. I'll show some of my results soon. Just search it online, Lumen. Use a code FOODLIES to get 10% off. Just getting started with these guys. It's something really cool. I'm a big fan of becoming metabolically flexible, and Lumen seems like it's going to be a great tool. Get 10% off. Use the code FOODLIES. There's a link in the show notes or just search for it online. LUMEN. So, Nose to Tail, sapien.org. You can find out everything there. You can join the tribe where we do the private Zoom calls and all the rest of the stuff. Extended show notes, the program. Join the newsletter there. But now, to the show with Dr. James DiNicolantonio. He's very cool. I've been following him for years on Instagram, read a couple of his books, Salt Fix, Super Fuel. His new book's called The Mineral Fix. 550 pages, 4,600 references or something like that. Really cool, really great deep dive into all the minerals. Get a lot of answers, get a lot of useful information from him today. He's really on board with my version of diet and lifestyle, the whole sapien idea, animal-based, key plant foods, get all the minerals, get all the vitamins, sun, sleep, the whole thing. Super simple. He's on board. So, Dr. James DiNicolantonio is a cardiovascular research scientist and doctor of pharmacy at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, Missouri, and author of The Salt Fix and Superfuel and The Mineral Fix. A well-respected and internationally known scientist and expert on health and nutrition, he has contributed extensively to health policy and has even testified in front of the Canadian Senate regarding the harms of added sugars. Dr. DiNicolantonio serves as associate editor of nutrition and British Medical Journal's BMJ Open Heart, a journal published in partnership with the British Cardiovascular Society. He is the author or co-author of approximately 200 publications in the medical literature. He is also on the editorial advisory boards of several medical journals. He has shared his expertise on the Dr. Oz Show, The Doctors, and international news media outlets. I love it. He's getting into the mainstream. So check this one out with Dr. James. You're going to love it. Here he is.
All right. We're live with Dr. James DiNicolantonio. How are you doing today?
Good, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Well, it's been a long time in the making. I've been following you on Instagram and whatever else for years, and you're always like right in line where I'm at. You're one of those people. I'm like, okay, some people, you have the carnivore people, they're going too far one way, and then some people are too far the other way. But I think you've got it figured out. So let's talk.
Appreciate that. Yeah, let's do it.
Also, I got your book. I'm gonna hold it up. This is is this a textbook or is this a book? Because this thing is.
I think it's both. It's like I tried to be scientific for the first couple chapters, and then there's more storytelling, as you know, as you get further in. So it's kind of it's like a mixture of like some storytelling chapters and historical documentation of copper and its uses in history, and then more scientific for medical professionals and things like that.
I loved it. And you're not going to believe this. I read every word. I actually read the whole book. It's like 600 pages. There's 4,600 something references. I read it all. So
congrats, man, that's quite the accomplishment.
Yeah, I chunk it out. So I go and I read in the sun. So I go out in the high noon sun, 20 minutes on each side. Just get my vitamin D, read about some minerals. Let's jump in. So, well, people may know you from your first book, The Salt Fix. Right. Yep. So that was great. Then I think I missed a book of yours, Immunity Fix.
Yeah. Immunity Fix came, Superfuel on Healthy Fats.
Oh, I read that one actually. Yeah.
Longevity Solution too with Dr. Fong.
Okay. Well, this one maybe you could recap some stuff from the other ones, but that's probably hard to do. But the Mineral Fix is obviously just about the minerals, which are super important. Maybe you could just give people a primer on why minerals are so important.
Yeah, I mean, and most of us tend to think about diet as macronutrients. Like, are you eating a high protein diet, or are you more on like a plant-based higher carb diet, or are you like on a ketogenic high fat diet? So like most people tend to just think about diets as macronutrients, and they just kind of adjust from there. But really it's micronutrients that really run the show, because they control enzyme function, they control fat burning capacity, they control hormone production. So you can sort of think of, micronutrients as sort of like what our tech runs on. If we're like a biological computer, the micronutrients are needed for us to function. And so it's kind of broken down into vitamins and minerals. And the body has, essential minerals that it has to consume on a fairly frequent basis. And in the book, we go over the top 10 minerals that about 1 out of 3 people, at least in the United States, are likely deficient in. And so, you can't produce serotonin, which helps with mood, or melatonin, which helps us sleep, without minerals. Like the enzymes that actually create serotonin and melatonin in the brain and other neurotransmitters like dopamine all depend on minerals and vitamins too to actually produce those substances. So it's just something that we cannot forget about when we're talking about health.
Yeah, I'm working on the Food Lies film right now, and we're trying to get this across to people. And most people do think of food as some people just think of food as just how I get through the day, or what is delicious, what can I stuff my face with. And then, like some more nutrition nerds might get into the macros, and then the real stories when you get into the micros. And there's a big story we're trying to tell is, and you mentioned in the book too, it's like how do you get enough micronutrients without eating too much food or calories in general? And most people are eating nutrient poor foods, mineral poor foods, so you can't really do this, right? You just end up eating too much, especially with processed foods and all this stuff. So the idea is nutrient density is at the core of this, and that's something that is lost on a lot of people. But how do people try to get more towards this nutrient dense side of eating?
Yeah, and I think too the thing that most people are confused about is you have the plant-based diet people saying, well, you can get nutrient density through plant foods, but then you also get all these polyphenols and these other substances that are healthy, and that's why you should be on a plant-based diet. But then you have the animal-based people that are saying, well, actually, the more bioavailable forms and the better absorption actually comes from animal foods. And it's like, who's right? And it's sort of like, when you look at the overall evidence, you sort of meet in the middle. I'm more of an animal-based, though. I think a lot of the evidence, at least nowadays, lies more towards being animal-based, because a lot of the foods, particularly plant foods, are now depleted in nutrition compared to just 100 years ago. And the primary reasons for that would be how we grow our plant foods. We grow for yield. So they grow very quickly and they don't have the time to take up the nutrients. So they're literally just more diluted. But also the chemical fertilizers, they also actually inhibit nutrient uptake. And then the decrease or the increase in the acidity of the soil, glyphosate, things like that, inhibiting the uptake of nutrients into the plant. Now, that does lead to less nutrition in animal foods, but typically across the board, if you look at the depletion of nutrients in animal foods, it's typically about 10 to 20%, whereas for plant foods, it's more like 30 to 40% reductions.
Interesting. And then maybe you could get into the plant foods just aren't as bioavailable in general. Not that we're going to be hating on plant foods this whole time, but
yeah, no, I'm not to hate on plant foods, but like take spinach, for example. There are nutrients that are bioavailable in spinach, like magnesium and potassium, but then there's nutrients that aren't bioavailable, like calcium and iron, because the oxalates bind to those minerals and reduce the uptake. So it's not like all minerals are not absorbable from plant foods, but there are certain ones. Calcium and iron are something that a ton of people, especially women, are very deficient in. So you shouldn't be relying on spinach for the iron, because the bioavailability of iron from spinach is about 2%, whereas from red meat, it's about 20%.
Yeah.
You have to keep those things in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I try to think about this stuff. I'm animal based as well. Everyone listening probably knows, but there are reasons to eat plant foods for many reasons, for flavor and enjoyment, and for other just nutrients that people like to claim, yes, everything's in meat. And, it's like, well, how much though? I mean, it may be more bioavailable, but just the full amounts aren't there. So.
Right. Yeah. I think there are certain nutrients that just simply are not enough in meat, where you have to source it from somewhere else. Not necessarily plants. You can get it through mineral waters, but calcium and magnesium are the two minerals that are fairly low in animal foods, where it's difficult to get optimal intakes unless you're consuming dairy to get the calcium, but dairy is typically low in magnesium. So then how do you get a good amount of magnesium? You got to get it through really like mineral rich waters. The only true downside to constantly consuming a high animal-based food is that the body can only excrete a certain amount of acid before there's a retention. The kidneys just simply have a certain capacity of acid excretion, which is typically between 40 and 70 milliequivalents of acid. And then the kidneys start retaining about 1 milliequivalent of acid for every 2.5 milliequivalents above that threshold. And so if you're on an animal-based diet, you're probably producing close to 200 milliequivalents of acid. In other words, you're probably 130 milliequivalents over the threshold. So you're retaining, 40 milliequivalents of acid. You have to breathe that acid out. That depletes bicarbonate, and that can strip bones and connective tissues and things like that. And so I've done a very deep dive on this, and it's true that foods absolutely contribute to the acid base status of the body, because certain acids that are produced simply cannot just be breathed out. And even if you can breathe it out, it will deplete bicarbonate, because every basically molecule of acid that you push out through breath, you have to deplete 1 milliequivalent or 1 molecule of bicarbonate. So there's no free lunch in breathing out acid either.
This is super important because some people are confused on this, because there is kind of this old like myths of like acid base, and I mean some of it is wrong and it's kind of this plant-based thing, but some of it is right, is what you're saying. Is there is some truth to this, and it kind of hurts carnivores' feelings a little bit, I've noticed.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why so many people are so confused is because you have to go back to the 1960s and look at Jack Lennon's data, who actually did he looked at sort of diets that were high in acid, or actually giving ammonium chloride and seeing how much the body can actually excrete, and looking at retention, and then looking at the calcium loss in the urine, which was dramatic once you reached a certain acid load. So you have to do balance studies to actually determine it. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. They did that so long ago that everybody has forgotten about those studies. And then you have the teams like Anthony Sebastian and Linda Frassetto, who have sort of done review papers going back and looking at those old balance studies, and definitely showing that we retain acid, and that retention of acid leads to depletions of our bicarbonate stores. And so the easiest way to just circumvent that is either sodium citrate, because citrate actually can convert into bicarbonate in the body, and citrate itself combines 3 molecules of acid. And that doesn't affect the pH of the stomach. So a lot of carnivores can simply just start consuming sodium citrate to offset the acid load. Or the other potentially more beneficial way is to consume bicarbonate mineral waters like Gerolsteiner or magnesia water, because they contain calcium, magnesium, and the bicarbonate. So if you consume those waters 30 minutes before a meal, you're going to absorb the bicarbonate, and it's not going to affect the pH of the stomach.
This is super interesting. So I think most people, when they think of acid and base, they think of that you're just, the vegans say you're going to eat meat, it's going to make your stomach acidic, and you're going to, and then they say it's linked to cancers. It's like, oh, acidic. So what you're saying, the stomach is very acidic, and what you eat, your body regulates that acidity very well. And it's like your stomach's like hydrochloric acid. It's like a vat of acid. I mean, but so it's not, we're not saying that eating a lot of meat is going to like screw up your whole pH, but there are downstream effects.
So basically the stomach acid is sort of separate from the body's total pH. Okay. And so you can't necessarily look at it from the perspective of stomach pH. So what I am saying is, if you do not offset acid retention, which can occur if you're eating a ton of animal foods, you will start retaining acid. And if you're not consuming enough bicarbonate molecules, you will start to deplete your bicarbonate stores, which will end up reducing bone mass, which can end up creating connective tissue, decreases in connective tissue. But usually that doesn't happen because you're eating such a high amount of protein. It offsets the breakdown of the muscle and tendon loss. So you can just exercise more to prevent that. But you can't, there's no way to offset the drop in bicarbonate, which will strip bone and increase calcium loss. This is the reason why a lot of people don't believe in this, is because blood pH typically stays within the normal range for a very long period of time. But what you will see is you typically start at a pH of 7.43, and it can go down to 7.36, and you're still considered normal. But that shows you that acid has absolutely gone up in the blood. And if that has happened, then the interstitial fluid is very acidic, because the interstitial fluid doesn't contain things like albumin, hemoglobin, which can help offset the acid in the blood. So interstitial fluid, if you're somewhat acidic in the blood, you're absolutely acidic in the interstitial fluid. That's
super interesting. So in your animal base, you're a team animal food, but you're just still trying to let people know about this. So let's go over the mitigation strategies. You talked about sodium citrate. Where does that come from? Are you talking about that as a supplement, or is there a way to get that in food?
Yeah, that would be a supplement, sodium citrate. To get something similar in food would be consuming sources of citric or citrate, or consuming sources of like basically fruits and vegetables, right? If you're animal based, right? And
Yeah.
that, I mean, obviously, some people tolerate some plant foods, some don't. The most alkaline foods that are plants are spinach, raisins, dates, bananas, potatoes. The other strategy would just be bicarbonate mineral waters, like Gerolsteiner. That's one other way to offset the acidosis. So those are some of the easy ways to mitigate. Some plant foods, mineral water, sodium citrate.
What about just bicarbonate is baking soda, basically. Can you just add a tiny bit of baking soda to your water?
Yeah, you can. You can do that too. But that doesn't replace the calcium and magnesium that's typically low on the animal foods. But you could just supplement with dairy for calcium and then magnesium as a supplement if you want.
See, interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, not everyone's going to buy the Gerolsteiner water. It's like how much? It's like $1 per bottle or something. I don't know.
It's like almost $2 a bottle.
$2. Yeah, it could add up. Interesting. So, but I've been hearing about this for years. I remember you talked about it like 2 years ago. I don't know if it Saladino and you had some sort of little discussion or something, but I remember because maybe it was even more than 2 years ago. I was hanging with Paul in LA and then I got this idea to test urinary pH and test you get a little strips and you could test the urinary pH after you eat and just see just different meals or different, like how it worked. Have you ever done that or looked into studies about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you technically want to do a fasting pH if you want to try to look at acidosis, because there's this what's called the alkaline wave after you consume a meal. So you don't want to look at a urinary pH unless it's been at least 4 hours since you've consumed a meal. So really, first morning urine pH is what you want to look at. Just like if you're looking at dehydration, you don't test throughout the day. You test first morning void if you're looking at dehydration at the urine. And so, yes, urinary pH, anything less than 6.8 to 7 is very indicative of acid retention. And ask a carnivore, ask a high quality. I've asked a bunch of high quality carnivores, some of the upper echelon. Their serum bicarbonates aren't good. You want a serum bicarbonate of 28. Typically, theirs are around 23 to 24, even those who are eating complete nose to tail. So just look at a serum bicarb, and I guarantee you it's not optimized.
And so how much, this might be hurting people's feelings, like I say, how much, well, if I know some people are more, they're just not as tolerant to these plant foods, but like how much of certain plant foods, or what do you believe are the quote safest plant foods? I do look at the plant food, the toxicity spectrum, and what are the least anti-nutrients. I was chugging the kale shakes and spinach shakes, and I don't think I did well on that. So yeah, I'm not interested in eating like tons of spinach anymore, but there's things like avocado or like, what are your plant foods and then how much?
Yep. So basically, the more tolerable plant foods would be potatoes and bananas, which you're going to have to consume almost basically about twice the amount to offset the acid from meat. So if you consume 8 ounces of meat, you'd have to consume like 16 ounces of potatoes or bananas in order to offset that acid. The reason why I like spinach, not as a shake, but as cooked spinach, is it's the opposite. You only have to consume half the amount of spinach to offset the acid load from meat. So if you eat 8 ounces of meat, 4 ounces of spinach will counteract that acid load.
That's good. Maybe I need to, well, yeah, cooking gets rid of some of the oxalates.
Yeah, a little bit. I think that's more lectins, but I have a review paper that covers all this stuff. Actually, I have 2 review papers on acidosis that should be coming out in the next couple of months. Once that comes out, that really details everything pretty well.
Okay. Well, that's cool. Well, I'm just glad we're kind of waking people up to this. And well, let's go back to all the minerals then. So we talked about why the minerals are so lacking, how we grow food. I talk about that a lot and have different, regenerative agriculture people on, and yeah, the soil's deficient. You talked about glyphosate and pesticides. What about heavy metals?
Yeah, so heavy metals, we cover in the book. And really what was interesting is that what actually matters more than just the amount of heavy metals is the ratio of minerals to heavy metals. So for example, we all know mercury is bad, but if you're getting mercury from a fish that is very high in selenium, it dramatically reduces the absorption and the toxicity of the mercury. So really eating a very high mineral dense diet is one of the best strategies to combat the harms from heavy metals. So heavy metals, when we talk about that, that's like arsenic, lead, cadmium, which can be stored for decades. It concentrates in the kidneys. So you got to be a little bit careful with eating kidney, because a lot of kidneys can be fairly highly contaminated in cadmium. And so those heavy metals are fairly prevalent, and that eating a lot of zinc is one of the best ways to actually combat cadmium, which fortunately, animal foods, particularly the muscle meat, is very high in zinc.
Mm-hmm. And then, oysters, speaking of zinc, this was interesting to me because I love eating oysters and I don't love eating liver, but I find ways to get in my diet. I have my company Nose to Tail. We have ground beef with liver and stuff mixed in. So that's a good way. But I kind of was woken up to this, that if you're eating too many oysters all the time, you could be throwing off your ratio of copper.
Yeah, so there's a couple problems with eating a lot of oysters. I'm not saying you shouldn't have any, but if you really eat more than 2 ounces every single day, you're over your upper limit for cadmium. So I've looked at numerous different sources on this. Same thing with scallops, very high in cadmium. So you just want to keep the amount that you consume pretty low, at least if it's on a daily basis. And then I was talking
about the zinc. So they have a lot of zinc, which is great, but you could be throwing off your ratio if you have too much zinc compared to other things like copper.
Yeah, it depends. So what the studies show is that if your intake of copper is at least 1 milligram, even 50 to 60 milligrams of zinc doesn't induce deficiency. So if you get your copper intake up to at least 1 milligram, you're fairly protected against a very high level of zinc. But yes, it is true that zinc supplementation studies that have looked at this, usually 60 to 100 milligrams per day, has shown that it can potentially induce copper deficiency over the long run. And that's typically because most diets in the United States don't even hit 1 milligram of copper.
Well, that's what I was going to say too. I mean, other than people listening, I don't think many people are getting that much copper. What are some good sources of copper?
One of the best sources, in my opinion, is liver. I try to consume like 1 ounce of liver 3 to 4 times a week because of this. Also for the vitamin A, which in order to utilize copper in the body, you have to have good vitamin A status. And then that's why so many people are iron deficient or iron deficiency anemia, because they're deficient in vitamin A and copper is required to transform iron to the form to get it onto transferrin so it can move around in the body, so it can be exported out of the liver. And vitamin A is required for copper to work. So if you're deficient in copper or vitamin A, you're not really going to be able to utilize iron that well that you're consuming through the diet. And so liver is great because it brings both vitamin A and copper to the table. And it's really difficult to get vitamin A, if you're not consuming liver, that unless you're consuming like cod liver oil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, liver has a lot of vitamin A. Some people say too much, which you can comment on. But yeah, the other vitamin A from plant foods is not the real. It's a preformed version. It's not the fully formed vitamin A. But what do you think about getting too much liver or too much vitamin A? Do you think that's a problem? I just heard someone talking about that as like a problem.
I mean, I think to a certain extent it could be. You'd have to be over 25,000 IUs every single day for probably 6 months. Mm-hmm. So, and probably closer to the 50,000 mark to really probably induce toxicity. But yeah, I think you could. I think that's potentially why people who eat polar bear liver, the Inuit that had done that, or they don't do that for a reason.
They don't do that for a reason. Yeah, I heard it's very high in cadmium too, the polar bear liver. And yeah, I mean, it's a very, it was like an extreme dose that it's not normal.
What's crazy is liver from different animals is the nutrient profile is completely different. So like bison liver is not nearly as high in vitamin A as beef liver. So like all these things are different. What's really interesting is if you look at true ancestral meats, they're much higher in nutrients compared to even grass-fed beef. So like venison, elk, and bison typically have 10 to 30% more minerals across the board for muscle meat.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting is their copper, their B1 thiamine, and their B2 is about 2 to 3 times higher than grass-fed beef. So it's interesting if you're sourcing really high quality ancestral muscle meats, you don't even need nearly as much liver versus grass-fed beef, which is kind of, I mean, that makes sense, right? Because we didn't really necessarily eat pastured beef.
Yeah.
Ancestrally, we ate, elk, venison, bison.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we domesticated the cattle. I'm trying to bring in more of that. I have some good bison coming in to nose to tail, and I'm looking at some venison from Maui. I got a friend who owns a big company in Maui, and they process up in the States, and then I'm trying to get a hold of it to get out to people. So
yeah, I eat their jerky. It's amazing. It's super expensive though. The Maui Nui venison.
Oh yeah, Maui Nui. Yeah, that's who I'm talking about.
Yep. Yeah, I eat their venison all the time. It's great. It's just super. It's like $8 for like a 2 or 3 ounce pack. I mean, it's very high in protein. Super expensive though.
Well, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. I may be able to get some deals going. So
cool.
Yeah, no, that's good, and the bison too, and the bison. Well, yeah, we have the primal mix too, where it has a liver mix in. So, what are the other reasons people are deficient in minerals? Because most people in America have chronic disease, and you wrote about how that is can be depleting in minerals.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the mineral, but like primarily you're looking at anytime you have more inflammation, you're going to have to direct the nutrients in the minerals from other functions towards their antioxidant function. So for example, copper and zinc make up copper zinc superoxide dismutase. And now you have to basically grab copper and zinc that used to be doing more, let's say, vital functions, and they have to be directed towards the superoxide dismutase to handle all the oxidative stress. And then the oxidative stress in the mitochondria is handled by manganese superoxide dismutase. So now you got to pull manganese and put more into the superoxide dismutase to handle inflammation. So anytime you have more inflammation or oxidative stress, it's a tax on your mineral status.
Wow. And okay. So copper, I want to go back to copper for a second, because you just mentioned copper. I interviewed a guy, Morley Robbins, who's like really into copper. It seems very important, and it seems like no one's talking about it. Are you there with that?
100%. And copper is actually it's my favorite mineral. Some people joke and be like, "You have a favorite mineral?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." And copper is because I think it's in 3 chapters, and 1 chapter specifically dedicated to the historic uses of it in like ancient Egypt and throughout history for healing bones and cuts and things like that. But I think the reason why copper is so important is because refined sugars deplete copper, and really muscle meat is a very, very high iron and zinc to copper ratio. And so many people aren't consuming high copper foods like seafood, like lobster, crab, and liver, which are high in copper. And if you're not consuming those foods, it's very difficult to get good amounts in. And that's one of the big, and the other factor too is copper is the most nutrient depleted mineral in plant foods. It's 70% across the board. No other mineral has been more depleted than copper. And that translates over into animal foods as well. We've actually lost, if you look at regular milk, 100% of the copper that used to be there is now gone. And so that's another reason why copper is very deficient in most people.
Wow. Yeah. So it's depleted in plant foods, and it's kind of depleted in animal foods, and people just aren't eating the animal foods that have the high copper. So there's tons of reasons why. And well, luckily, nose to tail eaters and all the, people are eating liver these days and getting more of it. But so maybe you could, without going into like tons of biochemistry, can you go into a little bit more on why it's so important in these reactions in our body and like down to the mitochondrial level?
Yeah, I mean, the two we covered, right? One, if you want to be able to export iron out of the liver and actually transport iron around in the body to do anything, um, there's this enzyme. It's called ceruloplasmin. It requires copper in order to work. And so, really, iron status is going to be very poor if you don't have good copper status. The second mechanism that we covered a little bit is the superoxide dismutase, which is really, most people look at vitamins as the antioxidants, but it's really your antioxidant enzymes that are the first line defense against oxidation, and they require minerals. And one of those enzymes is superoxide dismutase, which in the cytoplasm and in the blood requires copper and zinc, and in the mitochondria requires manganese for it to even work. So in order to handle superoxide anions, which are produced in the body through inflammation, you have to have good copper status. And then copper is required for an enzyme called lysyl oxidase to work, which cross-links type 1 collagen like a chain-link fence and creates really strong type 1 collagen. So if you want strong bones, skin, organs, you have to have good copper status. So you don't have good collagen status if you don't have good copper status.
And okay, most people, you were talking about muscle meat too. What's another reason why it's bad to just eat mostly muscle meat? Some people know about the methionine. It's like you're getting too high methionine and not enough glycine, but there's just some other reasons.
So yes, I think that's one of the biggest ones, is that you really, if you're just sourcing muscle meat, you're going to be deficient in glycine. Typically, most people, if you look at glycine turnover rates, are probably deficient in glycine by about 10 to 13 grams per day. But in some instances, it could be as high as 40 grams per day. And glycine is low in muscle meat and higher in collagenous meats and skin. So that's definitely one reason why I think it's important to either supplement with collagen and or glycine, or consume more collagenous meats to improve the glycine to methionine ratio. And what's interesting is a lot of people say that animal foods are bad and reduce longevity because it's high methionine, but the animal studies also show that if you just supplement with glycine, that inhibits the sort of quote unquote inhibition of life extension or whatever. So glycine is sort of like the life extending property, and it's not necessarily high methionine, it's the imbalance in glycine and methionine.
That makes sense. So our modern diets and practices have gone away from our ancestral ones. So then that's why the problems occur. It's not that the meat's bad. It's just we're not eating the whole animal. We're not eating the collagenous bits and the bone broth. And so, yeah, another thing you can do, well, you eat the meat that's by the bone. You can eat all the different, like joints and connective tissues and make bone broth.
Right. Yeah. And if you're making bone broth, it shouldn't just come from bones, because that actually will not create a lot of gelatin. So if you do bone broth, let's say you throw in a chicken skeleton, you're going to see there's like this much gelatin that forms when you put it in the fridge for like 8 hours. But if you throw in collagenous meats, right, turkey necks, drumsticks, you're going to see that like 60 to 70% of that is all gelatin. So you got to make sure that you're using collagenous meats when you're doing your bone broths.
This sounds like an ad for my company, Nose to Tail, but we're working on all this, and we're putting all the chicken feet in the broth, and we're selling those. We're getting all that stuff for the bone broth we're making, and so yeah, it's important.
That's great.
All right, so what's some more stuff? So kind of on the more immunity path, I always like to do whole foods, right? Instead of supplementing, I'm trying to figure out how I can not supplement. And right. I don't get sick anymore. Since for about 5 years, once I started changing my diet. And if I start to get a tiny bit sick, you have that feeling. What I do is I just eat a whole bunch of oysters, and it always works for me. But maybe that's just placebo, or maybe I'm just healthy. But what do you think about that for bioavailable minerals, zinc, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, what you're essentially doing, right, is like you're taking your zinc lozenges, but you're adding copper and all these other nutrients that oysters are high in. And so, I mean, that makes complete sense to me.
Yeah. Well,
because you don't even need a lozenge, actually. The studies show that oral intakes of zinc, typically about 40 milligrams per day, dramatically reduces upper respiratory tract infections, flus, things like that by like 70%. So.
Makes sense to me. And I mean, it's just get it from the real food. And here's another one about those oysters. So I had this idea, there's some superfoods that different cultures say, oh, the oysters, it's like for your libido. And I
Mhm.
always thought it was stupid. And then I kind of thought of it. It's like, okay, well, if everyone's just deficient in certain minerals and then they eat some oysters and now all of a sudden everything's working better, they're getting all that. I think there is something to it. It's just that you were deficient in these and now you're getting them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, deficiencies in minerals, particularly copper, have been shown to reduce sperm count, reduce the speed that sperm can swim, and reduce reproduction rates. So it makes complete sense that if you're deficient in minerals, that your libido is going to increase because sperm health increases.
Yeah, your just body works better. I think there's just, and that could happen with a lot of different foods. It's like, say, well, I know women who go vegan, they like lose their menstrual cycle or something, and then they just eat meat, and they they get all this iron and like real bioavailable stuff in their bodies. Like, okay, we're working again.
Right. Yeah. And that's the difference between like following a cult and following like tribes and versus like individuality and actually just testing things out. And I've gone on very, very high plant-based diets, almost vegan. And yes, I lost a ton of weight, but most of that was muscle mass. And yeah, it was super filling. And a lot of the weight loss was because I was so full from all this fiber in my stomach that my caloric intake was probably down at least 500 calories per day. And I was so thin, people were coming up to me and being like, are you sick? Like, is there something wrong? Like, that's how thin I was. So
yeah,
I think it can definitely, sorry about that. It can definitely like hurt the body. So.
Well, yeah, and not getting enough protein too. So what about, well, okay, I'll throw this one in because we talked about the carnivore and the pH stuff. Why don't animals have problems with this? I just want to throw this in. I forgot to bring it up earlier, but I think some carnivores listening might be wondering. They're like, oh, but lions and all these other carnivorous animals don't have problems with the pH. I mean, is it as simple as they have different digestive systems than us, or they have ways to regulate?
Well, the thing is number one, the damage is not very apparent, right? So it ends up leading to osteoporosis, but that doesn't kill you, right? It leads to maybe a bone fracture later in life. But I don't know. Have we really looked at like lion bones to know when they're aging, if they're optimal or not? But then also when you think about it, they eat the intestines and they consume the plant content of the animal. Mm-hmm. So actually carnivores aren't true carnivores. They are always consuming the plant contents of the intestines. Actually, the intestine is the first thing they typically eat, including the liver. And so the Inuit used to mimic this. So the Inuit, somehow they know to do this. Even in the dead of winter, they will search out seaweed at low tide, and they will eat the animal. They'll eat the plant contents of the intestines. They pass around like appetizers. So even the Inuit would know it was important to source a little bit of plant foods. And so I think, I don't know. I hope that explains it.
No, that makes sense to me. Speaking of, longevity and stuff. Well, I'm always interested in the longevity and how to thrive, not survive, right? Which is what you're talking about. It's like you could think you're doing fine and carnivore is going to help a lot of people, but we don't know those long-term effects or, if you're leaching calcium and it's going to come back to haunt you one day. But just talking about longevity in general, I think in the book you mentioned the free radical theory of aging. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could go into a little of that.
Yeah, so I think we used to think it was all about oxidative stress and free radicals. And in the book, we really talk about now it's about inducing hormesis or small amounts of stress on the body. And that is what really induces longevity. It's not about constant inhibiting inflammation and constantly ingesting all this anti-inflammatory stuff. It's really about creating a mild amount of oxidative stress so your body adapts and is stronger. And when you do that on a consistent basis, you end up developing longevity. And so this is somewhat how certain plant foods work. If they're not harming your health, what they do is they induce mild oxidative stress, and that increases NRF2, which then boosts all your body's endogenous antioxidant systems.
Yeah. Well, so NRF2, that's like your master. What is it called?
It basically is your antioxidant
That's what
response.
yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Antioxidant. It's like your master antioxidant. And there's different ways to sort of produce antioxidants or get it going. And it's not all about food. So you mentioned you could eat foods, but what are some other ways? And you also, there's NADH. Like, what are other ways to increase these antioxidants in your body that aren't just with food?
Well, one of the ways, is the animal foods too, because they're so high in minerals and vitamins, which are required to produce a lot of these things, a lot of these antioxidants. But sleep is very important. Melatonin actually doesn't just inhibit the inhibitor of NRF2, it actually increases the production of NRF2. It's one of the only molecules that actually stimulates the production of NRF2. So actually even exogenous melatonin, which has been used in certain viral infections, we won't cover the names of the virus, but has been shown to potentially be helpful. High doses of melatonin. There are a couple of meta-analyses that actually show high dose melatonin in cancer patients has dramatic benefits. And then there's a bunch of different supplements. It's all about really basically boosting SIRT1 and increasing AMPK. So, intermittent fasting or exercise helps with those. Sauna, heat, cold, sunlight, all these things boost NRF2.
Yeah, these are just part of being in nature. And we're talking about too in sort of like smaller doses instead of like a chronic inflammation type thing. It's like what you called it. Yeah, it's like an acute exposure. Like you do something, you go in a sauna for 20 minutes, and that's a lot different than exposing yourself to, I don't know, heavy metals, something that's just this chronic thing.
Right.
So, well, yeah, I guess I had this idea when I was getting my son, because I'm in Austin now, and I'm just getting roasted. It was like 100 degrees. And I think that's necessary. I think going out in nature and just getting like rocked, like I called it like getting rocked, like getting pounded. Like I grew up in Hawaii. When you just go and you jump in the waves and just get killed by these waves, it just wakes you up. There's something about nature where I think these kind of extreme circumstances in nature are very good for the human body, like jumping into a cold body of water, that's just freezing. I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that just every once in a while, you just want to get rocked by nature.
Yeah, you get wild, right? Because we evolved, right, in nature, and when you start stripping away nature, you're taking away things that you don't even realize you are, right? Like fresh air has more ozone. It literally has more oxygen in it. It has more of an antiviral, antibacterial effect. Like they used to treat patients in 1918 when basically we had a really, really bad flu going on, the bird flu. They would put them outside in fresh air and give them sunlight. And that was the way they treated patients, because they understood that it improved the immune system. So we try to mimic nature as best we can, but the best thing is nature itself. You're never going to be able to fully mimic it.
Just go out there and get it. Yeah. You can't take a pill. I mean, you could try to take some vitamin D supplementation if, you're up in England and it's cold and dark, but I mean, you just got to get out there, get the sun, get the real deal. So what is your strategy for certain viruses that may be going around, and like, what can people do, and have you stayed healthy in the last year and a half?
Yeah, I've stayed healthy. I've, to my knowledge, did not develop any type of virus that's quote unquote out there right now. Yeah, I think being animal-based is one of the most important things, because that's how you get the bioavailable nutrients. You gotta basically create a diet that's going to try to hit all those optimal nutrient intakes. And it really starts with about 12 ounces of red meat for the B12, the protein, the zinc, the iron. Without that base of red meat, it's very difficult to hit even adequate levels of those nutrients. And then you can start building off of that. Pastured eggs for selenium and a little bit of vitamin D, wild salmon twice a week, get in ½ ounce of liver every single day, maybe a little bit of spinach or a little bit of bicarbonate waters to offset the acidosis, things like that. I actually eat Ezekiel bread for the manganese, because manganese, unless you're eating mussels every single day, it's virtually impossible to get good amounts of manganese from animal foods. So that one might be something that a lot of people might want to supplement with. Same thing with boron. Boron's primarily in plant foods, but a lot of people enjoy an avocado. So that's a decent source for boron. So I try to just ensure optimal intakes. And then, I mean, if I were to get sick, there are obviously many supplements that have a ton of research. Colostrum is one, right? The lactoferrin in there. Beta glucans from baker's yeast have a lot of good data. Medicinal mushrooms have a lot of good antiviral data. We can't say it treats anything, but there's a lot of evidence for those type of supplements.
I love it. So the diet stuff you talked about, that's kind of like building a diet from scratch. Instead of saying, oh, I'm in this camp or I'm in that camp, we're just saying, how do you get your vitamins and minerals and protein? And you kind of just built it from scratch. It's just, well, we need this meat. We have red meat. We have the eggs. And I mean, this is just kind of what I've done the past 5 years. I was like, how do I not get myself into a camp and just look at just basic principles, and you can arrive at something that's very, nutrient dense and delicious, and it kind of checks off all the boxes. It's just, it doesn't have to be in a camp like paleo. It's like, okay, well, we're talking about dairy, and paleo people are like, oh, well, we didn't have dairy back then. And I'm like, all right, I don't care what we had. Right. I'm not saying go eat Snickers bars, but it's not always about just what we supposedly had or didn't have.
Right. Yeah. And exactly. I took it from the stance of, okay, these are all the vitamins and minerals I need. And I looked at the data on what the optimal intakes are for all of those. So how do I build a diet to optimize that? And then, of course, the other missing piece is hydration, because we lose a lot of salt through sweat, through caffeine, numerous medications, things like that. And so hydration strategies are very important too, to fuel your workouts as well. I typically try to hydrate in the morning, always 30 minutes before a meal, or at least 2 to 3 hours after a meal, because the water can dilute gastric juices and pancreatic enzymes. And you don't really want to have a ton of water during a meal, because you want to be able to digest and absorb the nutrients themselves. And salt is important to actually have stomach acid, because in order to produce hydrochloric acid, you need to ingest the chloride from salt in order to do that. So I think low salt diets to me are just terrible, especially if you're an athlete or you drink a lot of coffee.
Yeah, well, you wrote a whole book about it. And so when you're talking about hydration, you're not just talking about guzzling normal water. You're talking about getting good minerals with your water.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because basically just consuming plain water is not the best way to not only absorb water, because the sodium helps with absorption of water, but that can actually sometimes dehydrate you, because you can just pee out a lot of the water. So you can have a urine that looks very clear and you think you're hydrated, but really your urine is just diluted. You haven't gotten the fluid into the cell or into the blood. And so your blood volume could be down, your interstitial fluid can be down, even though your urine looks nice and clear and you think you're really hydrated.
Yeah, you need those electrolytes. So sodium, also, you're talking about hydrating up before exercise or well before in the morning. And then are you using other electrolytes, or are you just using the like Geraldine water, or just sodium? Like, what are you like? Do people I know some people have electrolyte mixes for sodium.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million ways you can do this, and I typically utilize different ways all the time. Like sometimes I'll drink some pickle juice in the morning. Other times, if I want to get the dose really well, I'll use like Redmond Relight, which has salt and magnesium in it as well. And I'll use that before like a really intense workout. But yeah, so it depends what your goals are. Like if your goal is to really dramatically improve athletic performance, then you have to start consuming salt and water about 90 minutes, maybe up to like 120 minutes prior to exercise, because it takes a while for that to boost the blood volume in order for it to work. If you try to hydrate during exercise, especially vigorous exercise, that's the worst time to hydrate, because gastric emptying is down so much that actually if you drink too much fluid, you will actually bloat and reduce performance. So it just depends what your goals are.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to improve performance longer down the line, then you actually want to become dehydrated acclimated, which improves performance after you've acclimated to the dehydration. So you wouldn't want to preload with salt and fluid all the time, because you're not inducing hormesis from the dehydration of exercise. You would do it before competition, because that's going to dramatically improve performance. But again, it's that hormetic response to dehydration why a lot of athletes are so good at performing, obviously, because of the dehydration they're constantly inducing.
That's interesting. Well, yeah. I think it's I didn't know about the 90 minutes before. That's good to know. And potassium too. Yeah, like Redmond Relight. Yeah, I'm a fan of Redmond, and they have it's potassium, magnesium, and their salt.
Yeah. And then typically most people don't consume enough salt. So you got to get the dose right too, and you got to get the timing right, because if you drink it too quickly, like let's say you just crush it all in 10 minutes, you're going to probably induce diarrhea, and you're not going to absorb a lot of it. And then it's not going to really have a lot of benefits. It should be consumed, the salt solution, over 30 to 60 minutes slowly. That's how hydration really should work. And you want the fluids to be about close to the same saltiness as blood in order to boost blood volume, because everyone's looking for the holy grail to exercise performance. And all the studies show that the linchpin, the one thing, the biggest thing that inhibits vigorous exercise performance is the drop in blood volume that occurs during exercise, because blood gets pushed to working muscle and to the skin to dissipate heat, and the blood volume drops, feeding the heart. That increases cardiovascular strain, and that's what drops performance. So if you can boost blood volume prior to performance with salt solutions, you will dramatically improve performance. But you can only do that if you consume a solution about as salty, if not slightly saltier, than blood.
Wow. Yeah, it's too bad salt's been the enemy for so long. But yeah, it's so interesting that that's like the simplest. It's like almost free. Like salt is almost free, but it could be the biggest exercise improvement.
Well, what's cool is, like, this comes back to animal-based and carnivore. It makes sense that consuming something as salty as your blood would be the best way to hydrate, because we evolved getting our salt through blood. That's how we hydrate it. So if you look at humans, right, we've lost our fur, and we're the only mammal, essentially, besides horses, that can really excrete a lot of salt and water to cool off. So that allowed us to persistent hunt animals in Africa and the savannas for hours. And then when we would consume the salty blood to rehydrate back. And so it makes sense that a salt solution that is as salty as the blood is the best way to hydrate and is the best way to absorb salt and water. And that's been shown in clinical studies. But it's cool to think about that that's actually how we used to hydrate in Africa, is getting that salty blood.
Well, I just did that in Africa in February, and I drank blood with the Maasai and the milk, and also they butchered a goat for us, and we just drank the goat blood straight without the milk. And yeah, I mean, it didn't taste bad. I thought it was pretty decent. And also we went out with the Hadza. They barely need water. Maybe you could comment on that real quick. It's so interesting when they eat like every part of the animal. You know, they are sucking on every single bone, and they are getting every drop of blood. They're getting it all. But they also could just roll out all day on a 10-hour hunt in the middle of the sun and be okay.
Yeah. Well, so that's interesting, actually, because they're heat acclimated, and actually heat acclimation dramatically increases sweat rates. So you would think they would need a ton more water, because their bodies are much more able to produce a lot more sweat than someone who is not heat acclimated. But if they're consuming blood, then that dramatically reduces how much water you actually need to consume, because it hydrates you so much better. So if you notice, if you're an athlete, if you consume just plain water, you got to urinate like within 20, 30 minutes because you're peeing out all that water. It's not a good way to hydrate. So your water needs will go down if you're consuming small sources of fluid that contain good amounts of salt.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't think they sweat it. Yeah, I mean they're just so used to it. I don't remember seeing sweat on them.
Maybe they genetically don't sweat that much, because if you or I want to sweat more and want to drop our sweat threshold where we start sweating much quicker, you go into a sauna, you become heat acclimated for 1 to 2 weeks. That's how you actually sweat more, and you become better at cooling off, because that's how we cool off, right? Is the evaporation of fluid. So when you become heat acclimated, you actually sweat a lot more. But maybe genetically, and I don't know if this has ever been looked into, if they're not sweating, that might have been a potential advantage to not sweat as much to reduce the fluid loss.
It seems like it, because they're just acclimated to that lifestyle so well, right? Like they can just go out. It's like they don't get tired, they don't sweat, they're at home out there.
I wonder too if having darker skin reduces the rise in core body temperature when the sun hits you versus having lighter skin. That's something that I've never thought about, but that, they're again genetically, their rise in core body temperature through heat and through sunlight may actually be a lot less than someone like you or me.
Could be. They're doing well over there. We were struggling. We almost didn't make it. We didn't take enough water, and oh man, it was rough by the end. All right, I got a couple more things here. I'm into fermented foods. All right, what do you got there?
Yeah, I think fermented foods are great if you want to increase the quote unquote lactobacillus bifidobacterium. I do think that's something helpful, like pickles or kimchi or sauerkraut, because that's something that we had consumed for thousands of years when we would utilize just salt to preserve food. It would sort of create these fermented foods. So I think historically, we probably consumed a fairly decent amount of those. I don't know how much further back though than maybe 20,000 years we would have consumed those foods, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a food that you didn't consume during evolution can't have health benefits.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's just a way to get in more plant foods without, I guess fermenting takes away some of the anti-nutrients and, I think it's great.
Yeah, I think I do agree. A lot of people tolerate fermented foods much better. And I think because they're not super fibrous as well, they don't contain a ton of like resistant starch or anything like that.
Yeah. Seaweed is an interesting one. Seaweed, a lot of people probably lack iodine. What's your deal with seaweeds?
I think you almost got to be like a real expert on seaweed and like, is that seaweed soaking up a ton of like toxins and heavy metals, or is it like a clean source? And like, it's hard for me to trust it. And so I haven't utilized a lot of it for that reason, because I can source iodine and other things. But it's true, a lot of seaweeds are very high in certain nutrients. Even certain types of nori actually have bioavailable B12. You can get B12 through certain animal foods, like nori, and certain irradiated mushrooms. But again, it's like, which one? And do you really trust this source? And that's why because I haven't like really looked into it that much, I'm not willing to like risk my B12 status on eating nori.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Hawaii eating you eat all kinds of nori. We call it nori. You still got to say it correctly. Nori.
Nori.
Okay. What about fortification? So iron, we talked about iron, and it's super important. And a lot of people are lacking in iron. But I kind of got down this little rabbit hole about how if you just fortify, we everything we do sort of in the mainstream is in the modern world seems to be a mistake. But we process foods, we take out all the nutrients, and then we just try to add back in things like iron. It seems like it goes wrong.
Yeah, well, especially for things like iron and maybe even copper too, because those two heavy metals are so reactive that I don't know if it's that great of an idea, specifically with iron for sure. If you should be consuming like ferrous sulfate versus getting iron through actual foods. I mean, what is interesting is almost all the copper supplement studies do show really good benefits on dropping inflammation, dropping blood pressure, dropping lipids, but I would still much rather get copper, which is a very reactive heavy metal, from animal foods than an isolated supplement, because I don't know, I'm not going to trust that the body isn't inducing some type of oxidative stress from consuming that type of a mineral, which is very reactive, which is why everyone always asks, well, why should you supplement with magnesium, but supplementing with iron is bad? And it's because iron is one of the most reactive toxic metals in the body. So if you're consuming it as an isolated supplement, that can be an issue, versus magnesium is not a highly reactive mineral.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And magnesium, like these electrolytes, it seems like there's just the only thing, if I don't supplement, I talked about not really supplementing at all, but like the electrolytes may be the one exception, like potassium, magnesium. It's just, we're so depleted in them and everyone's kind of deficient in them, it seems like. And it just seems like there's no downsides really.
If you're not drinking, let's say, something as salty as blood, then you're not consuming really true nose to tail. You're consuming these salt depleted muscle meats. So most people have to supplement the salt back 100%. Magnesium too, just because magnesium has been depleted a lot through the acidity of the soil, through the things we had talked about on, growing for yield and things like that. And so magnesium is a missing mineral because insulin kicks magnesium out in the urine, and insulin resistance prevents magnesium and potassium getting into the cell. So it's one of those minerals that needs insulin to really work in the body. Not every mineral needs insulin, but because it does, and 75% of us are insulin resistant, that's why so many people need more magnesium.
It's good to know. And then I'm going to let you go here, but I want to talk about sulfur as one more thing that we didn't cover yet. Tell us more.
Sulfur is, and even supplementing with something called MSM, which is basically increasing your sulfur content. And there's a lot of foods high in sulfur, like onions and broccoli and things like that. Very important for immune health, for muscle function, all this stuff. But the one somewhat downside is that the sulfate that is produced is negatively charged, and you can't just breathe it out. It has to come out in the urine. And you only utilize probably 20 to 30% of the sulfur that you're consuming. So you got all this other sulfur that you need to get rid of. And that requires a positively charged molecule to get rid of the sulfate. This is partly why the needs for magnesium, calcium, sodium, potassium, which are positively charged molecules, increase on an animal-based diet because you're consuming a lot more sulfur. And so that the sulfate that you're producing on an animal-based diet is pulling a lot of those positively charged ions out because you have to maintain electroneutrality in the kidneys in order to do that. So sulfur is great. Just make sure you're getting a lot of sodium, calcium, potassium, magnesium, and then you're getting all the benefits of the sulfur without the negatives of depleting those minerals.
Interesting. Yeah. And so sulfur is high in animal foods. And then you also mentioned some other one. It's like onions or garlic and some other.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. It sounds like we've hit it all. Reading your book kind of reinforced my diet. I think that it was like, okay, I'm doing it right. Eating nose to tail, I'm eating garlic and onions, and I eat some mushrooms and fermented foods and avocado. And yeah, I feel like I'm covering all the bases. What did we miss? I mean, we were not going to go into all these different elements again, but you talked about boron, selenium. I just want to just make sure we like hit them. Like, are people going to be getting these without trying?
I would say the only thing we probably didn't really cover is chromium. And we used to get chromium through bone marrow. That's actually one of the highest sources of chromium. Or lobster is a really good source of chromium. Oysters too. But again, chromium is a missing mineral because most people aren't consuming those foods. So a lot of people, especially athletes, we sweat out a lot of chromium. And the bioavailability is only 1%. So if you sweat out 10 micrograms of chromium, right, you need 100 micrograms to replace. Well, actually, you would need 1,000 micrograms of chromium to replace that loss. So I think chromium, especially if you're an athlete and you sweat a lot, is definitely something that probably a lot of athletes would benefit from, consuming like 400 micrograms of like a chromium percolinate once a day.
And then what foods contain chromium?
I think the highest is oysters, and then mussels after that, and then lobster and, grapes and grape juice have a little bit. But if you're not consuming like the oysters, the lobster, the mussels, everything else is pretty low. I mean, broccoli is maybe, I think it has like, I want to say 30 micrograms of chromium per 3.5 ounces, but you're supposed to be getting at least like 50 to 60. So, there's not a ton of good animal or foods to get at.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot. I think the listeners should check out the book. What's great is you have a lot of the tables. Well, for each mineral, you'll have tables on where the best sources are in food. So I love that. And yeah, get the book, Mineral Fix. What else? Where are you at online?
Dr. James Dinick is my website. And then most people just follow me on Instagram, which is at Dr. James Dinick, DINIC.
Yep. Good common sense posts on Instagram. I feel like we're trying to say the same message. Like, this is simple, guys. Let's just eat the whole foods. Let's just do these simple things. We're all good.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, man. Well, it's good talking to you. Thanks so much. And I will see you another time.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for sharing with a friend or family, giving a review on the podcast app or iTunes, starting back at episode 1, getting all the great info, going to nosetotail.org, get all the meats delivered to you, seasonings, body care, all the rest. Sapien.org for everything else. We have the program, the tribe. It's our private community where you can hang out with us, and the film Food Lies. You can find it all at sapien.org. So we'll see you next week.